The invitation arrived on a Thursday, which was the kind of detail Winifred Ashdale noticed, and no one else did. She was standing at the kitchen window of Hartmore when she saw the footman ride through the gates. Not the rear gates, the front ones, the ones that hadn't been opened for a family member since her father's funeral 14 months ago. She watched the horse slow, watched the footman dismount, watched him hand something to Mrs. Parrish, she corrected herself, to the housekeeper, the one Cecile had hired the month after the funeral, the one who did not know that Winifred had grown up in this house and had learned to read in the library on the second floor and had once, at the age of 7, hidden inside the cedar chest in the east corridor for an entire afternoon because she was pretending to be a stowaway. The housekeeper was not named Mrs. Parrish. Winifred reminded herself of this too. She was Winifred Ashdale. She had been, until 14 months ago, the only daughter of Sir Edmund Ashdale of Hartmore, Wiltshire. She was now, according to every document her stepmother had filed, with her stepmother's solicitor since the funeral, a distant relation of unclear standing who had chosen to remove herself from the household and seek employment elsewhere. The employment she had found was here, under a different name, with a borrowed reference letter, and hair pinned so severely that the housemaid who'd shown her to the servants' quarters on her first day had told her she looked as though she'd been assembled rather than born. She was the underscullery maid at her own family's estate. She had been for 11 weeks. The invitation, she would learn at supper, was for the Duke of Aldenmere's autumn gathering at Caldwell Park. The whole table went quiet when the housekeeper announced it. Even Tilly, who was 17 and had been in service since she was 13, and claimed that nothing could surprise her any longer, set down her bread. "Both daughters?" the cook asked. "Both daughters," the housekeeper confirmed. "And Lady Ashdale." Winifred kept her eyes on her plate. Both daughters meant Cecile's daughters. Genevieve, who was 23 and beautiful and mean in the particular way that beautiful people were mean when they'd been told for too long that beauty was sufficient, and Rowena, who was 20 and mean in a different way, quieter, more patient, the kind of mean that waited. They were not Sir Edmund Ashdale's daughters. They were his widow's daughters from her first marriage, and they had arrived at Hartmore 3 weeks after the wedding, looking at everything as though they were calculating its weight in currency. And Winifred had thought then, this is going to be a problem. She had been, as it turned out, the problem, not them. The gathering at Caldwell Park was in 9 days. Winifred did not know that Thursday evening that she was going to go. She decided on Saturday in the linen room while she was counting pillowcases that had been her grandmother's. There was a logic to it that she worked out slowly, the way she worked out most things now, quietly, without anyone noticing. The Duke of Aldenmere was the executor of her father's estate, not his personal solicitor, not the family's long-standing man of business, but the Duke himself, which was unusual enough that Winifred had spent weeks trying to understand why. Her father had known the Duke. They had corresponded. There had been letters. She had seen them years ago without reading them, which she regretted now with the specific intensity of regret that came from not knowing what you didn't know when you had the chance. If there was anyone who might know what had been done to her father's will, and to her it was the Duke of Aldenmere, and he would be at Caldwell Park in 9 days. Cecile would be there, Genevieve would be there, Rowena would be there. Winifred would need to go as someone else. She had been doing that already for 11 weeks. She was, hell, it occurred to her, better at it than she would have expected. The difficulty was not the getting there. The gathering at Caldwell Park was 3 days, and Cecile's household would travel as a party. The carriage, the trunks, the personal maids. There would be enough confusion in the packing and the loading and the inevitable crisis of Genevieve's hair that no one would count the underscullery maids twice. The difficulty was what she would do once she arrived. She needed to speak to the Duke without her stepmother's knowledge. She needed him to take her seriously. She needed, and this was the part she kept returning to, in the linen room, and later in the dark of the small bedroom she shared with Tilly and the other housemaid. She needed to look like herself, not the person she was now, not the assembled girl with the severe hair and the borrowed name, the person she had been before. She had one dress left. It had been her mother's, altered twice, and it was the color of deep water in November, and she had carried it across 3 counties in the bottom of a trunk, and she had not taken it out since she arrived at Hartmore, because taking it out would have meant something she wasn't ready for. She took it out on the Saturday night, after Tilly was asleep. It still fit. The journey to Caldwell Park took most of a day, and Winifred spent it wedged between a trunk of Rowena's evening slippers and a crate of preserves that the cook had insisted on sending along because she did not trust other people's kitchens. The undergroom shared the top of the second carriage with her and fell asleep before they'd cleared the county, which suited her. She spent the time watching the countryside and trying not to think about the last time she'd made this journey, which had been with her father 6 years ago, when the Duke's mother had still been alive and had kept a garden that Winifred had never forgotten. She did not think about what would happen if this failed. There was no use in it. Caldwell Park was larger than she remembered. Or perhaps she had been smaller. The house rose at the end of the avenue like something that had decided to be permanent and succeeded, and the evening light was doing something complicated with the stone that made it look as though it were lit from inside. The servants' entrance was around the back, through a yard that smelled of horses and wet stone, and Winifred went through it with the others and was assigned a room she would share with 4 people she had never met, and was given instructions about breakfast and about not using the main staircase and about the Duke's preferences regarding noise before 8 in the morning. She nodded. She filed the instructions. She waited. The first evening was a dinner, formal, 30 people or more. Winifred watched from the corridor as the guests arrived, learning the shape of the room, the pattern of movement, the way the Duke's household staff moved around him. The Duke himself she had not yet seen clearly. A dark coat, a deliberate way of moving. He said something to an older gentleman near the fireplace, and the gentleman laughed, and then the Duke turned, and for a moment she could see his face. He was younger than she'd expected. She did not know what she'd expected. Her father had spoken of him with a kind of respect that she'd associated with older men, with gravitas, with long experience of difficult things. He was perhaps 30, possibly less, and the look on his face when he was not speaking to anyone, the particular settled expression of someone attending to something other than the room around him, was not cold, exactly, but it was careful. The look of a person who had learned to watch before they spoke. She noted this and went back to the kitchen. The second day was the larger gathering. A luncheon, walking grounds in the afternoon, a reception in the evening. Winifred spent the morning working out the timing. She needed perhaps 15 minutes. She needed them in a room where Cecile would not walk in. She needed the Duke to listen. She had, she reflected, placed a great deal of faith in the Duke's willingness to listen. She went to the East Library at 2:30 in the afternoon, because she had learned that morning that the Duke spent an hour there every day when there were guests, going through correspondence. Not because he was unsociable, the Duke's valet had explained to someone in the corridor, but because if he didn't do it, then he'd be at it until midnight. And Her Grace the Dowager Duchess felt strongly about midnight. The library was empty when she arrived. She changed in the small anteroom that connected to it, which was cold, and not designed for changing in, and required a level of determination she was glad she couldn't see her own face for. The dress went on. The hairpins from the severe arrangement came out, and she pinned her hair the way her mother's maid had once shown her, the way she'd worn it for years, before Hartmore stopped being hers to come home to. She looked in the small mirror hung over the anteroom's writing desk. She looked like someone who belonged in the house. She had not looked like that in 11 months. She went and sat in the library and waited. He arrived at 20 minutes to 3, and he stopped when he saw her, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the length of the pause. He looked at her the way people looked at things that didn't fit a pattern they'd established, which meant he was already paying more attention than she'd counted on. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said. "I will explain why I'm here. I would ask only that you listen before you have me removed." He said nothing. He came further into the room, which she took as permission, and sat, not at the desk but in the chair nearest the window, the one that faced her. "My name," she said, "is Winifred Ashdale. I am the daughter of Sir Edmund Ashdale of Hartmore, who died 14 months ago. I believe you are the executor of his estate." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, or not quite surprise. Something more considered than that. "He left me a portion of Hartmore," she said. "Not the house, I understood that. The entail, I understood it was complicated. But he told me specifically 4 months before he died that he had made arrangements, that I would not be left without recourse. His words." She paused. "His widow has never mentioned those arrangements. Her solicitor has never contacted me. I have been told formally that my father's estate passed entirely to his widow in trust. You came to Caldwell Park as part of Lady Ashdale's household," the Duke said. It was not a question. She felt something tighten in her chest. "I came as an underscullery maid," she said, "under a name that isn't mine, because I had no other way to speak to you." The silence was long enough that she could hear the fire. "That dress," he said, "is not a housemaid's dress." "No," she said, "it was my mother's." He looked at her for a moment that was difficult to characterize. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "Tell me the rest of it." She told him. She told him about the 3 weeks between her father's death and the reading of the will, when Cecile had been quiet and careful and almost kind, and Winifred had thought. She had thought they might manage. She told him about the solicitor, who had arrived with documents she had not been permitted to examine, who had spoken to Cecile privately for an hour, and emerged looking like a man who had made a decision he intended to keep to himself. She told him about the morning she'd been called into the drawing room and told that her father's estate, upon legal review, provided for his widow and the widow's children, and that her own position was one of dependent relation rather than direct heir, and that, should she choose to seek her own establishment, there would be a small sum provided for that purpose. The sum had been enough for 3 months. She had made it last 11. She told him about the letters. Her father had written to her in the last year of his life, and she had saved everyone. And in 2 of them he had mentioned the arrangements he'd made, referred to them obliquely, but clearly enough that she had understood. She had those letters. She had kept them. She had them with her now, in the room she was sharing with 4 women she did not know, in the bottom of the same trunk that had carried the dress. The Duke of Aldenmere listened. This was the thing she had not fully anticipated. He actually listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look toward the door. He did not have the expression of a man enduring an unwelcome complication. When she finished, he was quiet. "I have the documents," he said. "The estate documents. I received them from the family solicitor as a matter of form, because of the correspondence I had with your father." He paused. "I have not examined them as closely as I now believe I should have." "Would you?" she said. It came out smaller than she intended. "Yes," he said, "I will." She nodded. She looked down at her hands. They were steadier than she would have expected. "Lady Ashdale is here," the Duke said, "at this gathering. She is currently, I believe, playing cards in the blue sitting room." "I know," Winifred said. "I will need 2 days," he said. "Perhaps 3. I have the documents in London. I will send for them. In the meantime," he stopped. "In the meantime, I think you should not continue in the capacity in which you arrived." She looked up. "You are Sir Edmund Ashdale's daughter," he said. "You should not be sleeping in the servants' quarters of someone else's house. I will tell my housekeeper that a guest has arrived unexpectedly. You will be given a room." "If Cecile sees me, she will see you," he said, and something in his voice was now quite different from the careful attention of the past half hour. "Miss Ashdale, if what you've told me is true—" He stopped again. "When you have the room," he said, "I would ask that you send me the letters." She sent the letters, that evening, with a note that was 4 lines long. She sat in the room, a proper guest room, east corridor, 2nd floor, with a view of the garden that she remembered from the visit when she was 12, and she read the note 3 times before she sealed it, because she wanted to make sure she had said what she meant, and not more. Dinner that evening was 40 people in the formal dining room, and Winifred arrived late enough that finding her place required asking a footman for assistance and walking the length of the table while 40 people registered her presence with varying degrees of interest. Cecile registered it from the far end. Winifred watched her stepmother's face go through 4 distinct expressions in the space of 2 seconds, which was, she reflected, a kind of accomplishment. The 5th expression was the one Cecile settled on, a particular social blankness that Winifred had watched her deploy 100 times. That meant nothing was wrong, and everything was being catalogued. Genevieve, at Cecile's right hand, did not bother with the social blankness. She stared with her mouth slightly open, which was unlike her, and for a moment she looked very young. Rowena, on Cecile's other side, looked at her plate. Winifred sat down. She accepted the soup. She spoke to the gentleman on her left about the late autumn weather and the state of the roads, which were apparently worse than usual, and to the woman on her right about a series of novels that Winifred had actually read, and that the woman, it emerged, had not. She did not look at the Duke. She was aware of where he was in the room with a kind of precision that was probably not useful, and that she chose not to examine. After dinner, in the drawing room, Cecile found her. Winifred, her voice, was the social voice, the smooth one. "What an unexpected surprise." "Yes," Winifred said. "I wasn't aware you knew Lord Aldenmere." "My father did," Winifred said. "They corresponded for years." A small pause. "Of course," Cecile said. "Of course, yes." She smiled. "You look well. That dress is lovely." "It was mother's," Winifred said. Cecile's smile remained exactly in place. This, Winifred thought, was the thing about Cecile. The smile was always exactly in place. It was its own kind of armor, and it had never, in the years Winifred had observed it, slipped. "We should speak," Cecile said. "At some point, privately." "Of course," Winifred said. They did not speak privately that evening. Winifred made sure of it. On the 2nd day, she walked the grounds in the morning and attended the luncheon and spent the afternoon in the East Library again, this time not alone. The Duke arrived with a younger man she recognized after a moment as his secretary, and they sat at the long table with documents that she recognized even at a distance as having come from her father's estate. She sat across from them and watched the Duke read. His secretary was the one who eventually said quietly, "Miss Ashdale, this document here, do you know if your father employed the solicitor before or after his marriage to Lady Ashdale?" She knew the answer. She said it. The secretary made a note. The Duke looked up from the papers. "Your father made a codicil," he said. "In the last year of his life, it is referenced in the original will, the codicil itself." He paused, and something in the pause told her what she was going to hear before she heard it. "The codicil does not appear in the documents I was sent." The room was very quiet. "It should be here," the Duke said. He was not, she noted, looking at her with pity. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the documents, with the focused attention of a person who was working something out. "It should be with the original. It was filed. I know it was filed because your father wrote to me when it was completed. In the letter, he mentioned the date, and that date is not reflected in any version of this will." "Could it have been lost?" the secretary asked. "It could have been," the Duke said. He looked at Winifred. It was not. There was another moment of silence. "What does this mean?" she asked. She knew, broadly. She wanted to hear him say it. "It means," he said carefully, "that I need to speak to the family solicitor and to Lady Ashdale." He paused. "Not today. I want to have this properly in order before that conversation occurs." "She'll know something is wrong," Winifred said. "From dinner last night she already knows." "I'm aware," he said. "She'll speak to you. She'll try to." Winifred stopped. She had a clear image of Cecile at her most practiced. The warmth, the reasonableness, the particular way she had of framing things so that any alternative reading seemed unkind or misguided. "She's very good at it," she said finally. "At making things seem the way she wants them to seem. I expect she is," the Duke said. He looked at her steadily. "So are you, I think? 11 weeks as an underscullery maid is not something most people could manage." She did not know what to say to that. She looked down at the documents on the table. "I don't need you to protect me from her," she said. "I need you to find the codicil." "Both," he said, "are possible." Cecile came to him that afternoon. Winifred knew because she saw them, from the window of her room, walking in the garden below, Cecile in the gray dress that she wore. When she wanted to appear reasonable and serious, the Duke with his hands behind his back and his gaze ahead of him. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She timed it. When it was over, the Duke came inside, and Cecile walked to the fountain at the far end of the garden and stood there for a while with her back to the house. Winifred watched her. She had a strange feeling looking at her stepmother standing there alone, which she identified eventually as something that was almost sorrow, except that it wasn't, exactly, because what she felt was not for Cecile's sake, but for the fact that it had come to this, that any of it had come to this, and that her father, who had tried to arrange things properly, had not understood what kind of person he had married. He had not been a fool. She had never thought him a fool. He had been a trusting man who had chosen to trust someone who had understood, better than he did, exactly what that trust was worth. The Duke sent his secretary to London that evening. He sent 2 letters with him, sealed. Rowena came to Winifred's room after dinner. She knocked, which surprised Winifred. She stood in the doorway, looking like she had rehearsed several different versions of this and abandoned them all, and was now operating without a script, which was unusual for Rowena. "I didn't know," she said, "about the codicil. I want to be clear about that." Winifred looked at her. "Genevieve didn't either," Rowena said. "We knew there was something. When the solicitor came, when she wouldn't let us in the room. We knew it was something she didn't want us to know. But we didn't ask." She paused. "We should have asked." Winifred did not say what she was thinking, which was that not asking had been, in its way, a choice. "Thank you," she said instead. Rowena nodded. She looked as though she wanted to say something else. She didn't. She went away. On the 3rd morning, Cecile did not come down to breakfast. Her maid said she was unwell. Genevieve was at breakfast and ate very little and looked out the window a great deal. The conversation around the table was general and pleasant and completely disconnected from everything that was happening, which was something Winifred had always found strange about gatherings. The way the surface of them could be entirely intact while the structure underneath was changing completely. The Duke sat across from her. He did not address her directly at breakfast. He passed the marmalade when she reached for it and said something to the gentleman beside him about the harvest, and then looked up and caught her eye once, briefly, in a way that communicated nothing specific and somehow still managed to communicate something. She was beginning to understand, she thought, why her father had respected him. The secretary returned on the afternoon of the third day with the documents and with a letter from a second solicitor that the Duke had apparently been consulting since some time the previous day without telling her, which she found herself unable to resent because the letter contained, among other things, a notarized copy of the missing codicil. Her father had been thorough. Whatever Cecile's solicitor had done, Sir Edmund Ashdale had been thorough. The codicil gave her Hartmore. Not the whole of it, the house, the grounds, the income from the estate. Not the liquid assets which were Cecile's, but the land. The house. The thing her family had held for 4 generations. She sat in the East Library with the document in her hands and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a word for. "Miss Ashdale," the Duke said. "Yes," she said. She looked up. He was looking at her with that careful attention that she had come to recognize over 3 days as simply the way he looked at things that mattered to him. "This will need to go through the proper channels," he said. "There will be a process. Lady Ashdale will have recourse to contest it, though I believe that recourse will not succeed." "There will be," he paused. "Sometime. Probably some unpleasantness." "I know," she said. "The family solicitor has already been contacted. He will need to answer some questions about the document's absence that I don't believe he will enjoy answering." "Good," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved at the edge of his expression. "There is also the matter," he said, "of where you go in the interim. Hartmore is technically in Lady Ashdale's custody until the estate is formally reviewed. You cannot." "I won't go back as a housemaid," she said. "No," he said, "that's not what I was going to suggest." He paused. "My mother is in residence at the Dower House at Caldwell Park through the winter. She is also, I should tell you, someone who knew your father and who has known about this situation for approximately 12 hours and has apparently been telling anyone who would listen that it is entirely unacceptable." He looked at her. "She has asked, through me, whether you would consider staying as her guest." Winifred looked at him for a moment. "Your mother knows about me," she said. "She has known about you," he said, "since your father first mentioned you in correspondence. He wrote to her on several occasions." "She has." He stopped. "She has been following this with considerable interest and concern." The thing moved in her chest again, differently this time. "I would be very glad," she said carefully, "to meet her." She met the Dowager Duchess that evening, in the garden, which was where the Dowager Duchess apparently spent most of her time regardless of the season, wearing a coat that seemed designed for a much colder climate and carrying on a one-sided argument with a rose bush that had not done what she expected of it. She was nothing like Winifred had imagined. She was small and direct and had the manner of someone who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought and found it remarkably freeing. She took Winifred's hands when they were introduced and held them for a moment and looked at her with clear gray eyes that were very like the Duke's. "Edmund's girl," she said. "Yes," Winifred said. "He talked about you," the Dowager said. "He was very proud of you. He worried too, but mostly proud." She squeezed Winifred's hands and released them. "Come and help me with this rose. I've been trying to tell it something for 3 weeks and it has not been listening." Winifred helped with the rose. They talked for an hour. Winifred said more in that hour than she'd said in the previous 11 months combined, which was not something she would have predicted, and which she thought, walking back inside as the light failed and the garden went cold and gray and quiet around them, her father probably would have predicted exactly. He had known the Dowager Duchess. Of course he had sent her here. The Duke was standing at the top of the garden steps when she came back in. He had been there, she thought, for some time. "She talks a great deal," he said. It was not a complaint, more an observation offered in the manner of someone who had grown up with this fact and reached a comfortable accommodation with it. "I didn't mind," Winifred said. He nodded. He looked out at the garden, which was mostly invisible now in the early dark. "I want to be honest with you about the timeline," he said. "The review of the estate documents will likely take 3 months, possibly 4. There are aspects of this that the court will need to examine. In the meantime—" "I know," she said. "I understood when I came here that it wouldn't be immediate." He looked at her sideways. "You came here as an underscullery maid with a plan to corner the estate executor in his own library," he said. "You had no guarantee that I would listen." "No," she said. "What would you have done if I hadn't?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it a great deal, in the linen room and the servants' corridor and the cold anteroom where she'd changed out of her borrowed name and back into herself. "Found another way," she said. "There's always another way. It just usually takes longer." He was quiet for a moment. The garden behind them was fully dark now. Somewhere inside the house someone was playing piano, something slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said, "that I didn't examine the documents more carefully when I first received them." She looked at him. "You didn't know. I should have known to look," he said. "Your father trusted me with this. I should have. I didn't do it well." It was the most direct statement of fault she had heard from anyone in 14 months, and she had to take a moment with it. "You're doing it now," she said. He nodded. He looked back at the dark garden. "Your father told me," he said, "in one of his last letters, that his greatest concern was that you would manage too well, that you were too capable of simply getting on with things, that you might not ask for help when you needed it." He paused. He said that was something he'd taught you by example, and that he wasn't sure he'd taught you the other thing. "What other thing?" she asked. "That sometimes you can let other people manage for a while," he said. "That it doesn't mean giving up, that it's not the same thing." She thought about the linen room, about the pillowcases, about standing in a cold anteroom in a borrowed identity and telling herself there was no use in thinking about what would happen if this failed. "He knew me well," she said. "He did," the Duke said. He turned from the garden. He was looking at her with the careful it now over 3 days, and that she was beginning to understand was not caution, exactly, was something steadier than caution. "So do I think, a little. Already." The piano inside went on, slow and deliberate, and the garden was entirely dark. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They went inside. The process took 4 months. It was, as the Duke had warned, occasionally unpleasant, and it involved 3 separate meetings with solicitors and 1 very uncomfortable interview in which Cecile's man of business attempted to suggest that the codicil had been added to the documents after the fact, which failed to be persuasive because the Duke had spent those 4 months being methodical in a way that Winifred suspected was characteristic, and that she had come to find unexpectedly steadying. Cecile left Hartmore in February. Rowena went with her. Genevieve, who had written Winifred a letter in November that was awkward and brief and was the most honest thing Winifred had ever seen her produce, remained in Wiltshire at a friend's house and sent a note when the matter was settled that said simply, "I'm glad." Winifred read it twice. Then she folded it and kept it. She came back to Hartmore on a gray morning in early March, when the grounds were still cold and the kitchen garden was only just beginning, and the cedar chest in the east corridor was exactly where it had always been. She stood in the hallway for a long moment, alone, before any of the staff arrived, and she looked at the stairs and the hall table and the light coming in from the east window the way she had known it all her life, and she thought of her father, who had been thorough, who had trusted the right people, who had worried that she managed too well. She had managed. She had also, eventually, asked for help. The Duke arrived 3 weeks later, ostensibly to review the final estate documents, and incidentally, to see the garden which the Dowager Duchess had been asking about since February, and which was, by late March, considerably more alive than it had been in the years Cecile had been at Hartmore. They walked it in the afternoon, Winifred and the Duke, while the estate's newly reinstated head gardener followed at a diplomatic distance and pretended to examine things that did not require examination. "You've had the east wall redone," the Duke said. "It needed it," she said. "Your father mentioned the east wall inn." He stopped. He looked at her sidelong. "I have been rereading the correspondence," he said. "All of it. I should have done it much earlier." "You're doing it now," she said. She heard herself say it and remembered saying it before, on the garden steps in October, in the dark. He heard it too. She could tell. They walked a little further. The head gardener found something very interesting to examine near the south border. "Miss Ashdale," the Duke said. "Yes," she said. He did not look away from the garden. He had, she had noticed, a habit of addressing difficult things while looking at something else, as though the difficulty required only part of his attention and the rest of him could afford to be elsewhere. She found this, for reasons she had largely stopped examining, rather endearing. "I would like to continue," he said, "to be in correspondence." "We are in correspondence," she said. "The estate review. Outside of the estate review," he said. She looked at the east wall, which was new and solid and exactly what it should be. "Yes," she said. "I think I would like that." The head gardener examined the south border for a while longer. The garden was very quiet. Above the wall, the March sky was the specific gray of early spring that looked like winter but wasn't. And somewhere further along the ground, a bird was doing something persistent and optimistic. And Hartmore was hers, and the man standing beside her was the one her father had trusted. And she was no longer managing, alone. And she had asked for help. He had listened. It was, she thought, a beginning.